last hurrah for Anbernic to close out the year, and this time around they returned to the Game Boy Advance inspirations with the RG34XX, which captures the spirit of the original Game Boy Advance model. And at times you might need to take a second look, because Anbernic's version is very close to its inspiration. But what gives it away is the display, and Anbernic finally returns to the 3:2 aspect ratio, and with the 34XX, introduces a 3.4-inch 3:2 aspect ratio display that uses a resolution of 720 by 480. But that's only one of the modern amenities that the 34XX offers, with some other neat tricks up its sleeve that at first glance isn't as obvious. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we take a deep dive into yet another H700 powered Anbernic handheld and find out if the 34XX is the advanced modern day Game Boy that we've been waiting for. As we always do, let's talk about the specs we have on hand here with the new RG34XX, as well as pricing, a quick unboxing, and of course take a tour around this very familiar looking handheld. First things first, I do really like the new packaging that we have here with the 34XX, which is clearly meant to resemble the original Game Boy Advance packaging, and certainly a nice nod to that handheld. The RG34XX ships with a very familiar chipset, the Allwinner H700. Which is a quad-core chip running 4 Cortex-A53 cores at a frequency of 1.5 GHz, and at this point is a very well-known entity, appearing in several handhelds for Anbernic this past year. But it's not all the same here, and we do have a 3.4-inch IPS OCA laminated display at a resolution of 720 by 480. And this is the first time that Anbernic has used this panel in one of their devices, and it is a 3:2 aspect ratio display, which we haven't seen in quite a bit. And the last time a 3:2 display made its way into an Anbernic handheld was the RG351P. And as we've seen with H700 handhelds this year, the 34XX ships with 1GB of LPDDR4 RAM and the usual multiple configurations, which starts at the base point of a primary 32GB microSD card that contains the operating system. Beyond that, Anbernic will offer additional options that ship with a secondary microSD card that is preloaded with games ranging from 64GB to 256GB, and as always, you can load your own games easily with the secondary microSD slot. On board, we've got Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 4.2. Now looking around the RG34XX, and at the top, starting at the right side, we have the menu button, mini HDMI out, the USB Type-C port, and a reset button. Now tucked behind the I/O here, we have the dual micro SD slots, the primary one for the OS and then the secondary one for the expandable storage to add more games. And at the bottom we have a jog wheel for volume control. A 3.5mm headset port, and way over on the left side we have the power button, and I do love its placement, which definitely is out of the way and avoids any accidental presses. The 34XX, like seen in many Anbernic devices this year, ships with their own firmware that has continued to improve over the year and packs a 3500 mAh battery that Anbernic claims offers up to 7 hours of battery life, but we will definitely be putting the 34XX through its paces later on in the battery rundown section. The 34XX does support C2C charging, and Anbernic recommends using a 5V 1.5A power adapter, which is not included in the box. And speaking of the box, let's take a quick look at the rest of the contents inside. We have an included screen protector and a set of wipes to get your device prepped for that screen protector, as well as the usual Anbernic style fold-out instruction sheet, which is always worth reading through to get familiar with some of the features and shortcuts in the OS. Not only that, but we have an included lanyard, which can be added to the 34XX, and as silly as it may seem, I think this is a pretty fun feature that also shares similarity with the original Game Boy Advance. I think many in the community will have fun customizing their own lanyards, kinda like I've done over here. Finally, we do have an included USB Type-A to Type-C cable, and that about does it for the package contents. Now at the time of publishing this video, the RG34XX should be available for ordering on both Anbernic's website, as well as their Aliexpress storefront, and starts at $69.99 US for the base setup with just the primary OS microSD card. And of course, in typical Anbernic fashion, we'll have a discounted early bird price of $63.99 for the first 12 hours of sale, and will be available in multiple colors, including an awesome indigo blue, black, and transparent red and green, which are the colors that I received here. and it seems quite appropriate for the time of year, considering Christmas is right around the corner and these two combined certainly capture the spirit of the holidays. But enough of that, let's go front side on the 34XX and talk about its controls, starting with the D-pad, which is quite different from other Anbernic devices, and there's a good reason for that since this is nearly identical to the original Game Boy Advance, right down to the size, shape, and even the feel, with some nuances. The original Game Boy Advance D-pad was a bit on the smaller side, and the 34XX retains the same exact size, so if this was an issue for you back with the original Game Boy Advance, not much changes here. Now this can be a good thing for better or worse, since for me personally, I think that Anbernic has done better D-pads in the past, like seen on the 40XXV, but on one hand, if you are a big fan of the original Game Boy Advance style, this will make you quite happy, since it's very similar in terms of its movement and pivot, with it being stiffer than other D-pads that we've seen from Anbernic, and in terms of smaller D-pads, something like the RG28XX comes to mind as a D-pad that I think is better than what we have here on the 34XX. The 34XX D-pad is also slightly stiffer than the original Game Boy Advance D-pad that I have here. Now it's very possible that my Game Boy Advance has the benefit of more than 20 years of breaking in that membrane. I've also noticed that the presses on the original Game Boy Advance D-pad are a bit shallower compared to Anbernic's version. And so while at first glance they feel somewhat similar, Anbernic's version does have some nuance to it that makes it slightly different. But we will investigate a bit further during the teardown portion. And during my usual Marvel vs. Capcom 2 test, the D-pad was responsive, but I did find myself having to focus a bit more on my movements with the D-pad and make sure I was carefully hitting the correct inputs because of it being a bit stiffer with a bit less movement than some of the other D-pads that I've used in the past. Again, this could very well break in over repeated use, but as it stands now, I can't quite roll the D-pad to pull off combos, and so maybe it's just a combination of my poor skills in fighting games, but it's definitely noticeable to me compared to something like the 40XXV, which is just an absolute joy to use, and I can roll those inputs a bit easier on it. Now going below the D-pad, we have the start and select button, and wouldn't you know, it's in the same exact position as the original Game Boy Advance. Now going over to the right side, we have 4 face buttons in the Nintendo style BAYX configuration, and this is the first change from its inspiration with the inclusion of the Y and X buttons here. And I really like the way that Anbernic very subtly integrated this modern amenity into their take on the Game Boy Advance form factor. The Y and X match the color of the shell, and here on these transparent models, we can see the Y and X peeking through the buttons themselves, which again is just a nice touch. But most importantly, the face buttons feel great, with a nice amount of range when pressed down. You can see this from the side that there's a solid amount of travel here, and pressing fully down, the buttons still sit above the face of the shell, and I don't feel any type of scraping or poor movement, and these are quite quiet since they are membrane based. The Y and X are smaller than the B and A buttons here, and partly because they retain the original Game Boy Advance setup of the B and A, right down to the font that is used on the B and A buttons. Now, one thing you might notice that's been omitted is the inclusion of any analog sticks, and that to me is a good thing since I don't think we're short on options when it comes to Anbernic devices with the H700 that include an analog stick or two. I like that Anbernic went all in on the Game Boy Advance design, and there's still plenty to enjoy without the inclusion of any analog stick. The subtle, modern amenities to the design are much preferred, especially for those that will probably be using this as a Game Boy Advance replacement first, and then maybe enjoy some games outside of that world, which is where the extra face buttons and shoulder buttons come into play, which is the perfect time to go topside and check out those shoulder buttons, which at first glance look identical to its inspiration, except that if we angle the 34XX just a little bit, you'll notice that Anbernic was quite sneaky, and managed to include an additional set of shoulder buttons. I know one thing's for sure, that my good friend Aish from Aish Talks Tech is going to be beyond ecstatic when he finds out that the shoulder buttons are quite quiet here, and they are so very satisfying to press down on. They have a nice, soft thunkiness to them, but I can't get over just how quiet they are, and the membranes that Anbernic is using here are really defined when you're pressing down on them. Now, for whatever reason, my right shoulder button is a bit louder than the one on the left, which is essentially silent, so that's a bit unfortunate, and it's actually the same thing for both of my units here, so I'd say that this is probably a consistent thing. Now, the L2 and R2 on the back feel quite similar, but thankfully they both sound the same and are also very quiet, which is very much a welcome thing. I will say that I have to extend my fingers just a bit, but I do like that the edge of the L2 and R2 have a slight slant to them, so that you can easily press down on them with just the tip of your index fingers. And of course, at the center of it all, we have the 3.4-inch 3:2 aspect ratio display that comes in at a resolution of 720 by 480, which is perfect scaling for 3 times the Game Boy Advance resolution of 240 by 160. The screen is obviously the highlight for those that are serious about their Game Boy Advance, looking its best, and this display is solid, but I don't think it's going to blow anyone away. The brightness performance is lacking here a bit, and it's definitely not the brightest display that I've used in this space, but for most that are using it indoors, it will be sufficient. And I was surprised that it did better than I expected outdoors in the very bright Arizona sun. We'll do some comparisons in just a little bit against some other familiar friends. Finally, the audio experience is nothing groundbreaking either, since we have only a single speaker here, which, for better or worse, recreates the Game Boy Advance experience right down to the same exact location as the original Game Boy Advance. It's not necessarily a bad thing, since Game Boy Advance games were designed with this in mind, and so having just a mono setup isn't a problem at all if you're strictly using this for Game Boy Advance or similar handheld devices. But that single speaker is crisp, loud, and clear even at the highest levels, and I tested out other platforms like Dreamcast, which were more than sufficient in terms of the experience, but let's listen in on my usual Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and take a quick listen here. And overall, as a package, I think the 34XX is a nicely made device that feels really good in the hands. And it's remarkable how close it feels to the original Game Boy Advance, which is not a bad thing at all, since that was a very well made handheld that could certainly take some abuse. I think it's amazing that we can have a handheld to this level of finishing. I only have the transparent colors on hand here, but the plastic feels great and the materials in general are very nice. But really, how does that all translate internally? And so we're gonna go in a little bit of a different order. But there's definitely a method to my madness, and so we will dive in with our usual teardown first, and then do device comparisons afterwards. I've got my trusty iFixit kit all ready to go, and let's bring back the 34XX and take a look at the back. And I think we will start first by removing the battery cover and the battery here. The battery cover is held into place with a Phillips screw, and for this screw I'll go ahead and use a Phillips head size 00-bit and quickly get this removed so we can take a look at the battery. The battery is held into place with a pretty strong adhesive, and so I used a pry tool to help me get it separated from the shell, which will require a bit of force. With the battery loose, we are now able to get to the cable that connects the battery to the mainboard, which can be easily removed. Just be careful to hold the cable securely when disconnecting it. So let's get a closer look at this battery, and as I mentioned before, the 34XX ships with a 3500 mAh battery, and again, we will see in a bit what this means in terms of real-world performance. Now, part of these teardowns is to typically see what the process is like to remove or replace a battery in any device, and for the 34XX, this is clearly a very simple process, which is always a welcome thing to see. The battery removal is also essential to move forward with the teardown, since another Phillips screw is hiding away under it. And so let's go ahead and remove this screw quickly so that we can move on and focus on the screws holding the back shell in place. For the 4 additional screws on the back plate, we will need to switch over to a 1.5mm hex bit, which is very common for most Anbernic handhelds, and with the 4 hex screws removed, the shell will now be able to separate from the front. Also, make sure that you removed any micro SD cards that you might have in the handheld. Okay, so there is a tab at the top in the center that holds the shell into place quite well, and it's kind of clipped in, so you will need to use a little bit of force here, and as long as you're careful, I don't think this clip will break that easily. But here's a closer look just so that you can get an idea of what to expect if you happen to need to do a teardown of your own. You will also want to be careful because there is a cable connecting the L2 and R2 board to the main board, so try to pry the back shell off with that in mind as well. Once you've got the shells separated, lift the retention tab and disconnect the cable from the shoulder button board. With the cable disconnected, we can finally take a look at the back shell with that board that handles the inputs for the L2 and R2, as well as a closer look at the mechanism for the L2 and R2 action, which does use a membrane, and you can see just how thunky those are. Another interesting detail is the October 25th, 2024 date that is stamped on the board, which gives us a good idea that Anbernic has been cooking this one up for a little bit. We can now get a closer look at the main board, which is a single board, so it's pretty nice and simple. We have that foam piece in the bottom center, which does give some separation to the battery and main board, as well as the adhesive that is used for it. Let's get in even closer and check out the L1 and R1 shoulder buttons, and you can hear that the left button is virtually silent. But then even with the back exposed, my right button is definitely noisier. I think I mentioned it before, but the volume adjustment isn't a wheel like seen on the original Game Boy Advance. Instead, it's more of a jog wheel that allows for volume up and down adjustment depending on which direction you press it. It's a clever design that pays homage to the original Game Boy Advance design, but it's not quite the same. So let's go a bit deeper here with the teardown, and in total we do have 5 Phillips screws holding the board in place, as well as a few cables that need to be disconnected here. First, I'll go ahead and disconnect the Wi-Fi antenna, which is cleverly mounted to the side piece and a pretty interesting design. And we might as well go ahead and remove the other side piece and put these aside. Let's go ahead and disconnect the shoulder button cables from the mainboard by gently lifting the tab, locking it into place for both sides. This is also a good opportunity to remove the buttons themselves from the shell. Okay, time to get these 5 Phillips screws removed from the mainboard so that we can then free it from the shell. We can use this same Phillips head size 00-bit, which works pretty well here. Now we're not quite done yet, and we do need to disconnect one sneaky cable for the display that is hidden and covered by a piece of black tape on the mainboard. Just gently peel back the small piece of tape and put it aside to save it for later, and then lift the tab so that we can free this cable. And now we are all good to go, and the board should easily lift up out from the front shell, and we can finally get a closer look at the mainboard as well as the other side. So something that I was curious about, and I think others will be as well, is the placement of the H700 chipset, which in the past Anbernic has certainly placed it in interesting locations. But for the 34XX, it seems to be in a spot that is mostly away from the battery and isolated enough that any of the heat generated by the chip probably won't be too much of an issue for the components or while gaming in terms of thermals. There's also a good amount of separation for the chip with layers of plastic from the shell that should give it enough breathing room in terms of thermals, and so I don't think we should see much issue with the H700 on the 34XX given the way things are laid out here. We do have another date that's stamped onto this mainboard with October 21st, 2024, and again it gives us a clue as to when Anbernic could have started cooking this one up. Okay, enough of the mainboard, let's get to the front shell and take a look at these face buttons and the D-pad, which will be interesting to see how Anbernic designed things here for their take on the Game Boy Advance form factor. One thing immediately noticeable to me is that typically membranes will be similar for both a D-pad and when using 4 face buttons, but in the case of the RG34XX, they are not, which makes sense since the Y and X buttons are smaller and it's a bit of a different arrangement, and as such we can see that the membranes are completely different shapes. The D-pad itself has a very defined center post, and quite a bit of thickness to the D-pad itself. Now looking at the face buttons, I am curious to see how they are keyed, and if we are able to switch the Nintendo layout to the Xbox layout, and it does appear that this can be done without issues, so if you're needing the arrangement to be ABXY, you can easily do that here. And if you recall, I said there was a method to my madness for going a bit out of order than I usually do, and so now it's time to do some comparisons by bringing in this awesome transparent original Game Boy Advance that just so happens to be disassembled already. We're gonna start with the Game Boy Advance this way and then compare them when they're all assembled again. So starting with the battery doors, and I don't think it's much of a surprise that these are completely different. The Game Boy Advance was designed to take 2 AA batteries, whereas the 34XX is using a rechargeable battery. The doors are also secured differently, with the Anbernic using a single Phillips screw to hold it in place, and Nintendo opting for the clip to easily free it from the shell. Now looking at the back shells, at first glance things look very similar here, but there are nuances to the design. First off, the Game Boy Advance is using 6 screws to hold the back shell into place. The battery compartment is also slightly small here given the use of the 2 AA batteries. And of course, the cartridge slot, which on the 34XX is obviously not present, and instead Anbernic used the space to add the L2 and R2 buttons, as well as the 2 microSD slots. But the shell size and shape are nearly identical between the two, and as far as clones go, Anbernic definitely got this part down. Again, there are very subtle differences between the two. For example, the lanyard holds are slightly different, but then looking at the screw placement, and they are identical. In fact, what's pretty hilarious here is that on the Anbernic shell, there are punch-outs or markings for screws 5 and 6, even though they aren't using them on the shell like seen on the Game Boy Advance. It's obvious to me that they started with an exact duplicate of the Game Boy Advance shell, and then kinda worked from there. So moving on, let's talk about these shoulder buttons here, which have a very different feel on the Game Boy Advance, and I'd describe them as being mushy in comparison to the 34XX's very defined thunk action. The Game Boy Advance shoulder buttons are essentially silent, whereas only my left side shoulder button is silent on the 34XX. So I'd say the Game Boy Advance still wins out in that aspect. Now the design on these are completely different from each other, even right down to the weight and feel of the plastic for the buttons themselves. On the inside, we can see that the contact point is in a different location as well, and then the metal tab which is not present for the 34XX buttons. In general, these are not one-to-one in any sense, so you can't really interchange them from either the 34XX or the Gameboy Advance. Again, there's lots of these very subtle nuances which can be seen right down to the font size and style. And again, we see this on more pieces as we continue to compare. The side pieces at first glance appear to be identical, but again, there are those subtle differences. The side piece that has the hole for the lanyard is slightly in a different location, as well as the inclusion of the Wi-Fi antenna, which to be fair is just a modern amenity of a 2024 handheld. But the changes are even more subtle than that, since there are slits on the bottom of the plastic that sit on the shell, and these are in completely different locations. Again, these pieces are not one-to-one and can't be interchanged. So let's now look at some differences on the main board, which of course I expected not to be the same, but in particular I was curious about the volume wheel, power button, and the 3.5mm headset port, which are all present on the Anbernic version in the same exact locations, but again those subtle differences are present. The Game Boy Advance use a power switch, whereas the 34XX just opts for a power button. And the volume control is different as well, with the Game Boy Advance using a wheel, but the 34XX has a jog wheel that you press in a different direction to adjust volume up and down. Finally, the 3.5mm headset port, while present in the same exact location, are actually sized a bit differently, so again, not a one-to-one match in the shell. And let's now compare the D-pad, face buttons, and membranes between the two, which already off the bat are completely different. The D-pad on the Game Boy Advance is slightly taller compared to Anbernic's version, and the center post is also quite different on the Anbernic one versus the one found on the Game Boy Advance, which has a larger circumference and is shorter. Anbernic's design is definitely different than what Nintendo has done here, including the disc at the bottom of the D-pad, whereas that is completely non-existent on the Anbernic one. What's interesting here is that obviously we won't be able to interchange these, but the D-pads are the same width and height, since I can drop in Anbernic's version into the Game Boy Advance and it will actually fit. But the same isn't true for the Game Boy Advance one going into the 34XX shell because of that disc at the bottom. The membranes are also quite different between the two, with the Game Boy Advance one hugging the center post, but the contacts are also much shorter and less thunky. Whereas on the 34XX membrane, we have taller contacts that have a more defined travel. And unsurprisingly, given what we've seen here all across the board, the face buttons are also not interchangeable since they are keyed completely different, as well as Anbernic adding those two additional face buttons on the front. And now let's compare the two when they are not completely disassembled and see how the differences compare here. Now this Game Boy Advance I have here is as is with the original screen and no modifications have been made to it. And so let's start with the screen, since without a doubt, the biggest and most welcome change for those that had a Game Boy Advance growing up or started out on their Game Boy Advance journey with the original model will definitely remember the very dim screen that even in a well-lit conditions was difficult to see, and I'm sure many like me had a warm light attached to it at all times. I do wish Anbernic had a slight nod to the Game Boy Advance by giving the bezel here a slight curve to mimic the shape of the original Game Boy Advance bezel. Regardless, it goes without saying that this 3.4-inch 3:2 aspect ratio display is a great fit for Game Boy Advance games and truly makes the 34XX feel like a modern day Game Boy Advance at a very affordable price. The feel between the two handhelds are so similar, and if you were a fan of the original Game Boy Advance horizontal form factor, then you will definitely be a fan of what Anbernic has done here, since really, in terms of how the handheld sits in your hands, it's pretty close to the original inspiration, for better or for worse, depending on your own personal preference. Now, thanks to some modern amenities, the 34XX does in fact weigh less than the original Game Boy Advance, which comes in at about 1 ounce heavier when you've got some AA batteries and a cartridge loaded up. But everything is sized identical, from the D-pad as we saw and the face buttons, the original L and R, but again with some modern inclusions like the L2 and R2. And during the teardown segment, we saw the subtleties of the two devices, and while sizing and shape are very similar, there are even subtleties of the way the buttons press and feel. The shoulder buttons on the 34XX are thunky with a very defined button press, whereas the ones on the Game Boy Advance are mushy and don't have as much of a travel. And I will say that I actually like the action of the button presses a bit more on the 34XX. And on the front side, the D-pads appear to look almost the same, but they are again just slightly different, and they do feel different in their movements. I will admit that the original Game Boy Advance D-pad isn't my favorite, but it does have a bit more movement over the one found on the 34XX, which I much prefer. The D-pad is a bit stiffer on the 34XX, and it's entirely possible that age plays a factor here, where the Game Boy Advance has had much more time to break in the membranes, but again, given what we saw internally, I'm not surprised that they're not identical in feel. Finally, the face buttons are probably the hardest for me to distinguish between because I like the action on both of these devices. The travel appears to be about the same, but the buttons on the 34XX sit higher than they do on the Game Boy Advance, and so it comes off feeling less shallow than the ones on the original Game Boy Advance. Again, these are all so subtle, and most importantly, the 34XX face buttons do work great, and I don't have really any issues with them. Oh, and for fun, I thought it was interesting that the font for the face buttons were almost identical between the two, but the same is not true for the markings on the other parts of the device like Start and Select, which I thought was kind of funny. Okay, so enough of all this original Game Boy Advance talk. Let's bring in another handheld to do a quick comparison to in terms of size. Earlier in the year, Anbernic treated us to their take on the Game Boy Advance SP with the RG35XX SP, and it was certainly a fan favorite for Anbernic devices. The 34XX is a pretty small handheld, but of course when the 35XX SP is closed, there's no beating it in terms of compactness and portability. But when the SP is fully opened, it does have a larger footprint, but in a completely different orientation, and so I feel like many are either in the camp that likes the compactness of the SP, or maybe prefers the horizontal form that the original Game Boy Advance had. Now, probably the most interesting thing here is that the 35XX SP uses a 4.3 3.5-inch display with a cool Game Boy Advance bezel out of the box that allows it to maintain that 3:2 aspect ratio. But because of that, the 34XX actually displays a slightly larger image since it is a native 3:2 aspect ratio display, despite it being just slightly smaller. I also noticed the colors are quite different between the two panels, and I much prefer the saturation here on the 34XX over the panel on the SP, which appears to be a bit more washed out in comparison, especially when you have them side by side. And finally, for one last comparison, here is the RG3421P, which is an oldie but a longtime Anbernic favorite for Game Boy Advance, since this is the last time we saw Anbernic use a 3:2 aspect ratio display. And on the RG3421P is a larger 3.5-inch display but at a lower resolution of 480 by 320. And it was great for Game Boy Advance emulation because it had double the resolution of the Game Boy Advance and could scale it perfectly. So with the 34XX, we do get the benefit of a higher resolution display at 720 by 480, which is effectively 3 times the original Game Boy Advance resolution, but just a slightly smaller display. The 351P is slightly wider than the 34XX, but isn't as thick or as tall, so compared to the 34XX, is still the more compact option here. Ironically, Anbernic did such a great job with the RG351P that in many ways, if you're content with what it offered for Game Boy Advance, there's probably not a whole lot of reasons to jump into a 34XX if you're looking at upgrading from the 351P for Game Boy Advance. And finally, let's talk about emulation. And with the H700, there isn't a whole lot of surprises here, since we've seen this chipset in a lot of handhelds this year, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, since it's a pretty well-known entity in terms of its capabilities, and of course when it comes to Game Boy Advance, the 34XX will have no issues with the entirety of the library on the Game Boy Advance. And really, the experience is awesome. It's basically what you would expect with the original Game Boy Advance, except that now it's been modernized with a great display. But when you're in-game enjoying one of the many Game Boy Advance classics, everything feels great in the hands, as if the original Game Boy Advance had come out today in 2024. Without a doubt, if you're looking to play Game Boy Advance games, and maybe you don't have a device that is dedicated to it, or perhaps you want this form factor, I think you can't go wrong here, especially at its price point. The Game Boy Advance library is vast and full of tons of hidden gems, and the best part of devices like the 34XX is capturing the magic that we felt back when we were younger, or perhaps you're discovering the library for the first time. And the 34XX is definitely a great way to experience those gems for those new to the platform. It's pretty wild to me that even to this day, I am still discovering new favorites, since the Game Boy Advance library is vast and full of tons of interesting titles, ranging from ports that were better than they have any right to be, original experiences, and everything else in between. And while the 34XX does not have any analog sticks in its arrangement, that doesn't necessarily mean we can't enjoy platforms like the PlayStation 1, since there were truly only a handful of games that had a hard requirement for analog stick controls, which means that basically the entirety of the PlayStation 1 library can be enjoyed on the 34XX, since we also have the L2 and R2 buttons here on the 34XX. And really, what a wild thing to see here on a device that looks like a Game Boy Advance, but can play the vast and amazing library of games from the PlayStation 1. There's no doubt that the retro tech teenager would have been absolutely blown away by playing the PlayStation 1 version of Crash Team Racing on the original Game Boy Advance. And the same can be said for the Nintendo 64, which surprisingly does a lot better than one might expect with just having the D-pad. By the way, for any platforms that you want to map the analog stick to the D-pad, just tap on the power button once and the stock firmware will take care of this automatically, which is a really nice thing to have here. I tested a lot of my personal favorites for Nintendo 64, including some Wave Race 64, and it works great. The most demanding of N64 titles like Yoshi's Story will still be an issue with the H700, but for the most part, things are quite solid on the Nintendo 64 front since very few games really use the D-pad and analog stick for inputs, and so you can easily map the analog stick controls to the D-pad if you're wanting to explore Nintendo 64 on a device like the 34XX. The cool thing though is that the H700 can even handle a good portion of the Sega Dreamcast library, and certainly not every game will control as well, being limited to just the D-pad, and there were definitely games that relied on the analog stick as well as the D-pad, but it's still a fun platform to see happening on the Game Boy Advance form factor, and I know I certainly would have loved to play some Cosmic Smash on a device like the Game Boy Advance. By the way, definitely check out the crazy, no pun intended, Dreamcast ports to the Game Boy Advance that were published by THQ, like Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, and Space Channel 5. Finally, the H700 can handle some PSP, and even though I think it's a platform I'm personally less interested in because of the 16:9 aspect ratio that the PlayStation Portable had, it's certainly a novelty that I think many will still explore, just because of how neat it is to see it running on the Game Boy Advance form factor. Now, the thing that's interesting here is that stretching the PSP image to utilize the entirety of the 3.4-inch 3.2 display isn't as bad as one might expect, since it needs to do less stretching on this display over one that is 4.3, and so because of that, it still looks pretty solid here, but like N64 and Dreamcast, you will be limited to games that will work with just the D-pad, and so consider it a fun bonus here on the 34XX. Regardless, I am a pretty simple person, and just seeing games like Burnout Legends, Pac-Man Championship Edition, and Lumines running on this Game Boy Advance form factor puts a smile on my face. Oh, and I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about one of my favorite genres in gaming, which happens to be shmups. And one thing I love about the stock Anbernic firmware is the vertical arcade section they have that automatically takes care of controls. So if you launch games like 1943 or Dodonpachi here for example, it will put the games in the correct orientation, and best of all, the controls will be mapped in a way so that you can enjoy these games in Tate mode. And let me tell you, this is a pretty fun thing to do with the 34XX, which surprisingly is pretty comfortable this way, and if you end up getting your hands on a 34XX, definitely try this out. And so, after all of this gaming, what can we expect to see from the 3500 mAh battery on the 34XX when it comes to real-world performance in gaming? Well, let's start out with the lightest test, and using Mega Man X2 for the Super Nintendo, I have the 34XX set to use a volume setting of 5, which is the equivalent to 50%, and the display brightness of 3, which is also the equivalent of 50% brightness, and the 34XX managed nearly 8.5 hours of on-screen time with its 3500 mAh battery, and I think that's pretty solid. Now for a bit more demanding test, I went with some Crash Bandicoot Warped for the PlayStation 1, with the same settings as before, which resulted in about 7.5 hours of on-screen time, and in general I'd say we are definitely staying close to the 7-hour claim that Anbernic has stated for the battery life. And in terms of standby performance, I left one of my units on sleep mode overnight at 67%, and then came back to the device about 12 hours later, and it had dropped to 61%, which I think is pretty solid and is about 1% for every 2 hours. Finally, charging time using just the recommended 5V 1.5 amp power adapter, charging time from 0% to 100% was about 2 hours and 45 minutes. Finally, I wanted to quickly talk about the stock Anbernic firmware, which definitely has come a long way since the start of the year, and it's nice to see that Anbernic continues to improve and refine their out-of-the-box experience, which I think for many will be more than enough. I just wanted to mention that I did accidentally come across an issue with the sleep experience on the 34XX for Dreamcast, which would not go into any type of standby, but it worked just fine for other platforms regardless of it being set out of the box, or if I went in manually to set the quick shutdown feature. I did let Anbernic know about this issue, so I hope that they will correct it at some point in the future. But for most, I really do think the stock Anbernic firmware will be more than enough, but thanks to the 34XX using the H700, we will also get to enjoy the various custom firmware options, and so really, Anbernic moving to unify their budget handhelds to this specific chipset was a brilliant move that has clearly paid off over the year. And so with that, I think it's time to wrap up things here, and really, what else is there to say except that if you're looking for that modern Game Boy Advance experience that accurately captures the spirit and essence of the original Game Boy Advance, there's no doubt that the 34XX is the modern day replacement you're looking for, but as I said earlier, it becomes less interesting if you already have a device that might be dedicated to Game Boy Advance like the older RG351P or the 35XX SP that released earlier in the year. If you're a huge fan of the original Game Boy Advance form factor, the 34XX is a wonderful tribute to the original device and captures the joy of holding the Game Boy Advance for the first time, but with all the modern amenities that we've come to enjoy and expect in this space. Between the price point, build quality, and those modern features, I think Anbernic has yet again put together a very solid package that will no doubt bring joy to many, especially for those OG Game Boy Advance fans. And that budget combination with the H700 is no doubt far from finished for Anbernic, despite what they've been saying for the better part of 2024. And I'm almost positive in the coming new year we will see more with the H700. But until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.